This is Susan Gillis. I'm a curator at the Boca Raton Historical Society. We are at the Schmidt Boca Raton History Museum. And today is Thursday, May 16th of 2024. And I am here with Dr. Peter Barrett to talk about his life when he lived here as a youngster. Dr. Barrett, would you please state your name, your age, and where your family is from originally?
Okay. Well, I'm Peter Barrett, and I have lived for some time now in California, but during World War II, we lived all through the war right here in Boca Raton, and that's why I'm back.
Very good. So you were born in California, were
I
you?
was in 1934.
And was your whole family from California?
That's a longer story.
But-
They originated in the East Coast,
Okay.
Illinois and New Jersey, but my dad was in real estate in the Los Angeles area, and even prior to the active war going on in the late 30s and 40s, his mother, who lived here in Boca Raton, my grandparents, his mother became ill, and we were living in Los Angeles, and her husband, my grandfather, was elderly, and my father said, well, we need to take care of him, and so we packed up, put everything in a trailer in 1939, and headed east with a big trailer, and with my sister and myself in the back seat of a 1938 Ford, and actually maybe a 1935 Ford, and headed this way. And then initially, for the first year or so, we lived out in Floresta, and were involved. My father and mother were involved in the care of my grandmother, who not long after passed away, and that's how we came to be in Boca Raton. And just about then, a year after we arrived here, the war broke out in full force across the world.
And so do you recall in Floresta, you probably rented that house? Do you
Yes,
think that's
yeah,
correct?
we didn't own it, no,
Right,
it was
right.
a rental house, a lovely spot. It was, doesn't look quite the same way these days. We were kind of in the middle of the jungle.
Right.
You didn't have far to walk until you had to be sure you weren't stepping into a small stream or whatever. There was jungle all around, and we had within 100 yards of our house, place we would go for walks. Sometimes there was a little stream. It was all wet, but there were little streams in the midst of this, and we used to go and count the number of little alligators we could see.
Ooh.
That was and we'd take along something to feed them. We never saw a big mama. We was just always saw were the babies, and we never had any trouble with them, but they were there. And my father was careful to take us to places where he thought the alligators wouldn't be, and we never saw a big one.
But there were other people living in the neighborhood then in Floresta?
There were probably a dozen people. I really don't know. Tony, my age, lived next door, but that's the only name I can come up with. They had geese, and my father always admired their choice of a pet or animal, because he said they're good guard animals, and they were. If you came close to the house, those geese really let you know about it.
Geese, interesting. So then your family moved to the beach. Tell us about that.
We did. Well, as I said before, my grandmother was ill, and then she did pass away. And at that point, then my parents and my grandfather decided it would be helpful for us to be closer to him, and we moved to the beach where he lived in the Boca Raton villas. And the Boca Raton villas were built by him in the middle 1930s, perhaps 1935. He was in business before that up in Chicago, and but planning for retirement, they had invested, with my father's help actually, in choosing a lot on the east side of Boca Raton Lake. And so it was an empty lot. Everything was empty in those days, in the 1930s, in this area. And but he picked his lot. I'm speaking now of my grandfather, who then worked with an architect whose name I don't have. It's written down somewhere, and built 4 villas with the intent of renting them in the practice of the day, which was that when it got too cold up north, the snowbirds would fly south and come down and stay for 1 or 2 months. So the 4 buildings that we're talking about here were rented to long-term, really winter-time renters. We lived in, well, initially we were in Floresta, but then we lived in one of them, and my grandfather lived in another, and rented the other 2, and all during the war.
So we were talking about snowbirds.
Right.
Yes. And when did they come? When did they leave? Do you approximately?
Well, I don't have a good way of answering that really, but and of course then the war broke out and everything, the patterns changed. And in fact, then some of our renters were officers from the base. And so that the old pattern kind of died along with the advent of the war. But we were always full. And we lived in one, and then my grandfather passed away, and that resulted then in having 3 of those units that we rented. And it became, most of them were being rented then by officers at the base.
Yeah, and your granddad was E. Barrett, right?
That's correct,
Right.
Edward E. Barrett.
Okay, and we'll talk more about him in a minute.
Good.
And the submarine activity. So what's your sort of earliest memories of Boca? You talked about Floresta Little Beach. Maybe was there a downtown? Were there any grocery stores?
Well, there were those Brink's grocery store, and one sort of add-on to that grocery store was there actually later on was another one, but we always went to Brink's grocery stores. And one of the family stories is that while sitting in the car waiting for my mother to get, or my father to get something out of the grocery store, my sister was sitting next to me and she said to my mother, "How do you spell vegetable?" and anyway, she'd been studying the sign and it was spelled wrong on Brink's grocery store. So that was always just kind of a family joke, but she was of an age to be that alert in things relating to school.
And this is your sister Martha?
That's my sister Martha, and she was 3 years older than I was.
Very good. And where was Brink's grocery store located?
Right across the street from the city hall,
Okay.
more or less. You know, it's a catty corner or whatever you want to call it. Right there was there were a couple of buildings. One was the post office, and we had box 234. And then next to that was Brink's, and there was something else on the west end of it that I think actually was a part of the grocery store, but that was the building and that was it. Now at some point along the way another grocery store either was created or I became aware of it, but just sort of around the corner to the west of Brink's and the City Hall was another grocery store later on, and that's also where the bus stop was for the school, at least for the big kids. Big kids went in a bus up to Delray Beach School, and at some point my sister was on that on a regular basis, and I was a tag along, you know, in the car that got her there or something. But that was right around the corner. But that was it, really. and
The post office and so on, was that to the north of the building here?
Yes.
In what we call the Haggerty, but was it a two-story building? Do you
I
recall?
don't recall it as 2 stories.
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to be certain.
But I think Branks was right there at some point in time, and, so the post office, before it moved, actually east of here, we think it was just to the north of what is today.
Yes, it was just across the street, right immediately next door to on the east side of Brink's grocery store.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Very
box
good.
234, I could reach
Yes.
it.
Yes, tell me, what else was in town?
Not much. Let's see, what else was there? Because City Hall, which we all thought was pretty special. And the City Hall is fortunately still here, and we're in it.
Mm-hmm.
And just outside of it, meaning to the west, there was a lawn, a very nice lawn. There weren't very many lawns in Boca Raton. This had a nice one, and there were royal palm trees that grew there, and I remember that because they were different. We had lots of palm trees in Florida, but they weren't royal palms. And so it was a special spot. And somehow or other, I always connect then in thinking about that little park with a alligator problem that happened after a hurricane. And someone went onto the beach after the hurricane. There's always interesting things that wash up during a hurricane. Well, apparently one of the things that washed up was an alligator, a great big, huge alligator. And it was obviously dead, he thought, lying there in the surf. And somehow or other, he and his friends, and I don't know why, but he thought he'd show the rest of the town this big alligator. Because we didn't see very many, and this was unusual. And so he and a couple of friends somehow put that in the back of his pickup truck and brought it up to the city hall and dumped it out on the lawn. And there was that dead alligator. And a huge crowd assembled to look at the alligator, and consisted of either 4 or 5 people. That's a crowd in Boca Raton. And everybody was admiring this big alligator when the alligator decided to be a part of the party. And he got up and was doing whatever alligators do, and starting to move around, and the crowd of 4 or 5 people got nervous and said, asked Brownie, that was our police force, to dispatch this dangerous alligator. And so Brownie pulled out his trusty revolver and click, click, tried to shoot, and his gun was so rusty or something that it wouldn't go off, and he ran into the city hall, got himself a shotgun, and came out, and that was the end of Mr. Alligator. But the alligator had some good ideas. He just went on to better places where alligators go.
That's a great story. You had mentioned to me there was at least one bar in town.
Yes, and I just know that. I never went in it.
Right.
But if you go from the beach, if you went westbound on Palmetto Park Drive, and then you came to what we called the Lincoln Highway, and that was the road that was made out of, that had poured concrete, which we thought was a big deal. I never had seen a road that had poured concrete, and that was a part of a system and a big story that I won't try to relate here. So it was clearly the main boulevard in town, and near the corner then of Palmetto Park and the Lincoln Highway, there was a gas station, and then there was a couple of stores, and one of them was a bar, and it had lights on the outside that were yellow or something, and I don't remember if they were blinking, but that was the bar. And my dad, in terms of consuming any alcohol, he was a once a year one beer person, so nobody in our family went to the bar.
I believe that was Brown's, which is today where Flanagan's is, so it's a block away from here. So next I'd like to talk about school, because you were a youngster. And tell me again how old you were when you arrived.
5.
Oh,
Yeah.
really small, yes.
5
Yes.
when we hit Floresta, yeah.
And
go ahead.
so tell me about, eventually you went to school. Where did you go to school? And when was that? Was it first grade?
No, and of course the choice of which school to go to was very easy. There was one, and I arrived and was not quite old enough for the first grade, but there weren't any other kids, so I was the kindergarten for about half of a year. I've sort of lost track, but then in first grade, and in the early years of the war, in the early 40s, the school itself, well, it was set up to have 8 grades, and the plan was to have grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8 in 4 different rooms. When we arrived, there were 3 teachers, and not long after that, there were 2 teachers. And this was war, and things changed, and I remember Mrs. McDonald was going to be my 3rd grade teacher, but after a couple of days in the 3rd grade with her, I remember that her husband got transferred and off she went. And so most of the war, we had 2 teachers. One was my mother, and she was then teaching grades 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Mm-hmm.
And Mrs. Tappan was teaching in grades 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the Boca Raton school.
And tell me your mother's name.
Jessie Barrett, Jessie Fullerton Barrett.
Mm-hmm. Did you have her as a teacher?
Yes, for the first 3 years, and for the first really 4 years, either 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. McDonald, that I was to have, I think I mentioned, left early. She was going to be my 3rd grade teacher, but she vanished, and so then there were the 2 teachers.
Mm-hmm.
When we first arrived, there was a 3rd, and that was Mrs. Collier, and she was the principal, and she had the 7th and 8th grade, I believe, grades. After that, the kids that were older than that all went up to the school in Delray Beach. So that was the end of schooling in Boca Raton after the 8th grade. But for most of the war, there were 2 teachers in grades 1 through 4 and 5 through 8.
Approximately how many students do you think there were at the school?
I think in the first 4 grades, I think there were something like 20, and similar amount in the upper grades of 5 through 8.
Do you think these were, say, during the war years, or do you think you went to school with any youngsters whose dads may have been officers? Were they mostly locals, or were they?
Well, it was all locals except for one.
Okay.
And that was Nancy Skeel, who was a very nice young lady and my first girlfriend. She was my first girlfriend, and in a longer story, I would explain how we exchanged Christmas cards for the next 70 years. But at any rate, that was Nancy Skeel. And she was my first girlfriend. Her father was the head of the base. He was I don't know his title, but he was for several years. But then they got transferred, and I didn't see her again for another 50 years. But we met we went to dinner in Boston. She and her husband and my wife and I went to dinner in the 1960s or 70s in Boston.
That's wonderful, yes. And I've had the pleasure of meeting her and her hubby, and brought us many wonderful photographs, and that's thanks to you, too, for her collection. Yeah. Wonderful, yes, she had wonderful memories for us. You mentioned to me that Jessie visited the Boca Raton Negro School, as it was. Please tell me about that.
Okay. She went there several times, and at least once I went along. But there was a school up in what we called Pearl City, and it was a wooden building, and consisted of two big, fairly sized big rooms, and you went up a little porch and inside, and there were the classroom seats, and that's where she taught. But then in the back of that room was a door to her apartment. She lived right there, and it was spick and span. And she was. I was just there once. My mother went several times. But even then, as in my small size, I noticed how well she had things in hand. She was just a really. She worked well with the kids, had interesting things to say, kept their interest, was a good teacher. And part of the teaching also was to teach kids how households could be run, and how to do things, practical things, as well as book learning, but both went on. She was an excellent teacher.
Well, it must have been quite a challenge to handle all those different grades at one time.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you recall, I'm sure it was pretty rustic, because that's a little old country schoolhouse. Do you recall if there was indoor plumbing or anything like that?
I couldn't tell you one way or the other. It was not anything that I noticed either way.
But your school was masonry,
Yes, and
yeah.
we had a toilet, and there's a girls' room and a boys' room.
Okay. And you remember the old gymnasium as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, it was a big room. Everything else in terms of size and rooms around Boca Raton or anywhere were usually one stories and one room at a time kind of places. The school though had a separate building right next to it, which was the gym with a basketball court and all sorts of things. Some rows of seats for the spectators and a little stage. And that was a building that was just immediately next and sort of in back a little bit of the rest of the school. I remember the stage because that was the site of my first and last really stage performance. I've given many lectures, but I wasn't asked to do a lecture. And I don't know how old I was. It was probably 7, and it was a Christmas event, and there were big kids, and then there were kids like me. There were where some kind mother would point me somewhere to be on stage, and I think I was an M. I don't know how I got an M, but so we were in boxes. I guess that's part of Christmas. Anyway, I was M in Christmas on the stage for a performance. And that's the last stage performance I've given.
Very good, very good. Well, everyone needs that experience. Now, you told me that you had a classmate who was from the Yamato colony, a Japanese.
Aiko, yes.
Aiko? And tell me a little bit about her. What do you remember?
She was, because she was different. She was a Japanese American, and even though I read the history books and understand that there was a large colony of Japanese Americans nearby somewhere, they weren't in the school, except for Aiko, and she came along maybe in the 3rd or 4th grade.
Okay.
And I thought she was kind of neat.
Uh-huh.
I don't know what she thought, but she was a pretty neat young lady. Every day when she came, somebody drove her. That was the only way. Either you walked your bicycle or drove. But anyway, she came with her mother and somebody else, and they would let her off, and then she'd disappear again. But she didn't come to our school until perhaps the 4th grade. I don't know where she was before that.
Interesting. I think she was a Kobayashi. We only had a couple of families left then, but I think that she's a Kobayashi. Not 100% sure about that.
Well, I remember having, on May Day, when we had the maypole, of course in those days you had ribbons and things, and you did things with the maypole, And I just remember her being there, and it was a special time to, you know, for her to be my special girlfriend.
Wonderful. You have shared with us some potsherds you've found on the beach during your time here. Can you tell us a little bit about the circumstances and when you found those, where and when and how you found those potsherds?
All right. Well, there's lots to tell here because it was starting in 1942. The German submarine fleet was very active, and of course there were huge amounts of shipping that were coming from both South America and also from the New Orleans port that would come around and go in a northerly direction using the Gulf Stream for extra boost. And of course the Gulf Stream is located about 4 miles right off most of Florida's, but Boca Raton is the closest spot to the Gulf Stream. And this location was not overlooked by the Germans, who in 1942 in particular were determined to block the shipping that was going along there, which was most of it headed toward England. Without the shipping of various goods, including armaments, to England, they would have been cut off. Hitler was in his ascendancy at that point in terms of their armed conflicts, and he was fighting on two fronts. He had invaded Poland, of course, on September 1, and was planning actively to invade England. They needed supplies, and of course he was trying to cut off supplies from the United States, and the submarines, that was their task, and they were very good at it for a long time. We saw from our house, or very close by, at least a dozen, maybe as many as 17 ships that were torpedoed offshore. And one in particular that I remember woke us up in the middle of the night at 2 in the morning or whatever. I was in bed, and I remember it well because I remember thinking that I'm going to be falling out of bed. It shook me in my bed with a huge thud. I was half asleep, of course, but it hit so hard that I had to sort of stabilize myself to stay in bed. And of course, I was on shore, and the ship had been torpedoed, a dozen miles or 4 or 5 miles offshore. But that impact was just huge at all that distance. And on that occasion, we went up to the little hill there, right, 10 or 20 yards from our house, to look, and there was a big ship on fire. And we couldn't hear any explosions, but we saw it burning intensely. That kind of interested me. I don't know why, but it was not just a fire, it was a raging inferno. Presumably oil and other goods and so on, but it was going. We saw a lot of other ships, a dozen over, in particular 1942, but not as dramatically from our point of view as that one that woke us up that night. But commonly what we would see is a pillar of smoke rising up gently into the sky, and then there was a ship here but on fire, and the pillar of smoke, and they were in the Gulf Stream, and they'd be slowly go by the sinking but not yet sunk ship being moved northward in the Gulf Stream, but they had been torpedoed basically right there on that spot, which meant that there were submarines that knew the right place to be. That's the narrowest, that's the closest the Gulf Stream comes, and that's where the shipping traffic went, and that's of course where the German subs went.
So you were eyewitness, and was there flotsam? There were bodies that would come ashore and so on?
They did here and there. We never saw any. We did not see any lifeboats, for instance. We saw pieces of life rafts. We found a German sailor's hat. That's a different kind of shipwreck.
Very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, because of course, the United States was trying its best. This was an early time in the war, and we were not prepared. We as a country, but the Germans had figured out that the narrowest spot and the best place for a submarine was right there where Boca Raton, out our front door, back door.
So you have donated to us a wonderful can of coffee and a letter about balata,
Yes.
which
yes.
is, and that came ashore.
They
Tell
did.
us a little bit about that.
Okay, well, episodically, when ships went down, things washed up on the shore. And if it was as it turned out, one of the ships had a big load of Maxwell House coffee. And those cans floated up, and this was at a time when everything was being rationed, including coffee. And the coffee cans were, I may get this backwards, but my dad liked the drip grind, and this was not the drip, or it was the other way around. But he always, but we got dozens of cans of coffee that way, just washed up. The cans themselves were interesting because they were no longer nice round coffee cans, but they had 8 sides, which meant that they were under intense pressure, and water is a non-compressible substance, and so it compresses anything it can, which a coffee can then turned into same can but 8 sides, other things that would wash up was included crude rubber that I will describe it in more detail. But the other things floated up. We found a box one time of an empty box that it to me was just a box. And one of our tasks that day on the beach for my sister and myself was we had to keep the beach clear of seaweed so that the people renting in our houses could walk on the beach and not just have a lot of sterile seaweed. And I found an old box and used it one day and just put the seaweed in it, and I took it and dumped it and so on. Later in the day, my dad looked at it and realized that on that box that I was using, there was a label and it said Hamburg, Germany. And what that meant was that this had been thrown out as garbage from a German submarine. And this was of great interest to the United States. And over the course of time, because so much had happened and there had been so many sinkings, my dad had been in contact with the local FBI agent, and they knew each other and were good friends over time. And my dad looked at the box that I pulled in, and he realized that it said Hamburg, Germany, told the FBI. And it was a school day. One day when the FBI agent and my father came to my school in the middle of the day and pulled me out of school, and we drove together, and the FBI man wanted to know exactly where I had found the box and so on. And we turned in a lot of the different things to the FBI in that way, and they were very helpful.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you also donated to us some very important prehistoric potsherds.
Which, I'm sorry.
Prehistoric pottery, ceramic.
Okay.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Early in the war, it's at some level the state decided to improve or create the road right along the beach from our area up to Delray Beach. Now, there had been the road there, but anyway, they improved it. And in so doing, one place where they improved it was to go through a hill. And I think the area I'm talking about is now called Yamamoto Park. Is it?
Yamato, it's Milani Park, but Yamato Rock.
Yamato Rock.
Mm-hmm.
And any rate, it was at that location where a bulldozer cut through the side of the hill, and then it was noticed that sticking out of the hill were pieces of pottery and bones. And that was of interest to us. My dad, in particular, was very interested in old Indian civilization and what had gone before, and finding things that they might have left behind. And we went up there, and as I say, there were things just sticking right out of the little wall there. Up above that cut, there's a little hill, not a big one, but a little hill. And digging there were more bones and things. And from there, you could see the coral reef that was just out front of that spot. And in the water of that reef, over that reef, perhaps a quarter mile out, there was, at low tide, there was always something sticking out, which I never got out to. It was kind of a dangerous reef to either to swim around or walk on, and I never got out there, but we were told that was an anchor. And the surmise was that a Spanish ship had sunk there long before, and that the bones we found were probably both Spanish and Indian bones and so forth, from a colony of American Indians that had lived there.
Very interesting. Want to ask you a little bit about wartime. Oh, well, you were a plane spotter.
Yes.
With your mom. Yes. Tell me about that.
Well, at the beginning of the war, it became clear that the U.S. was not prepared, and Florida in particular. My dad always used to say that if the Germans came with a regiment of soldiers, nobody would know about it for a week. There wasn't anybody there. Certainly not in Boca Raton. There were bases in Jacksonville and in Miami, and then over on the West Coast in Pensacola, but there wasn't much at all at the beginning of the war. Everybody in town was encouraged to do something, and we all did. And for a big segment of the town, I mean, the town wasn't very big. You and I have talked about populations, but it was very, very small. But everybody pitched in, and at that point, my father was working up north, meaning Chicago area, with helping to make LSTs, which were big landing ships that were very important in World War II. And so it was my mother and my sister and myself were there in Boca Raton, and our assignment or agreement or something, somehow or other, we became airplane spotters in the civilian watchtower, which was established roughly at the same beach, or a couple of miles north. I'm not sure exactly where. That was set up to be airplane spotters, and everybody in town had some kind of task. I never went to one of the grown-up meetings, but my parents did, and I got the news about things, and everybody had an assignment. Everybody pitched in one way or another. My mother and my sister and I ended up being airplane spotters on Fridays from 3 to 6 in the evening or till dark. The tower was, 50 feet high, something like that, made of wood. And it was just fun to get up there in that tower. I was, at that point, probably 7. And there'd been so much news about war and so forth, and armies marching and invasions and Germans and everything else. And little boys like to play wars. It's sad to say, but that's what little boys do. And as you know, I ended up with a whole lot of toy soldiers that are now here at the Historical Society. But I was interested intensely also in the airplanes and submarines. And so I and my sister and mother as well, became spotters. The tower, as I say, was about 50 feet up, just had one office that was, I don't know, 30 by 30 feet, something like that. And inside, hanging from the ceiling, were black hard rubber models of all the relevant airplanes. And that included Japanese and German and American and English. And so there are a lot of potential airplanes. Many, not all, but many of those were created as models that hung from the ceiling. There was we had a little work desk right in the middle and two phones. One was a regular phone and the other one was red. My mother said, never pick up that red one. And I didn't. So once in my life, I did what she asked. So, because then you were calling the Army. There was a direct line apparently to Jacksonville. And we didn't see any submarines offshore, but from that tower, 2 were spotted. And the story I'm going to tell you now, I'm not sure whether it's apocryphal or not. I wasn't there. But apparently a submarine was spotted, phone call up to Jacksonville, and about half an hour later, an airplane arrived, overhead. And we didn't have a radio. I don't know how this all happened, but apparently he radioed back to base that here he was in the area we'd stipulated, but he couldn't see any submarines, but he was an Army plane and he wasn't allowed to go out over the water. I mean, that's what I don't know what really happened, but that's what they said.
Okay.
And that may have been just an interesting story or real, I don't know. But we saw no submarines. We found the things I've told you about, German sailors' hats and things on the beach, but we didn't ever see any spies or anything else in person.
So what would happen if you actually saw a plane? What did you have to do?
We would pick up the red phone and call, which would be a call to Jacksonville, and say there's a plane here and we've identified it as so-and-so. And then the master plan was that they would send out an airplane from either Miami but somehow or other Jacksonville was the key source. That was where our hotline went, I think. I mean, I don't think it went to Miami. We went to Jacksonville.
You tell us a little bit about the Boca Raton Club when the soldiers were stationed there. You had occasion to visit there as well.
Okay. Right. When we arrived there in Boca Raton and lived as we did in the villas next to the ocean on the northeast side of the lake, there was nothing around the lake, zero, except for we called it the Nixon House. I don't know who Nixon was, but it was empty. And it was across the lake, right at the end there, in the north end, where we were. Immediately next to us on the south was the Sanborn Mansion, a walled, very extravagant, lovely home. To the north, about 100 yards, was Mrs. Dixon's house. So those 3 buildings, that is Mrs. Dixon, and then there was moving from north to south, then there was a big vacant lot, and then our 4 houses, and then the Sanborns, and then there was nothing either way, 8 miles or so, north or south, nothing, except jungle. And across the lake, catty corner, and really in the southwest end of the lake was what we called the club, the Boca Raton Club, which is still there by a name that's close to that. But it was the only other thing on the lake beside the so-called Nixon House, which was empty, and where we lived. The building next door that I mentioned, the Sandburns home, was a lovely mansion, a 2-story house with a great big front living room window facing the ocean. And they were only there about half the year, each year. But that was the total population, if you will, of the area and the club. The club, we called it what was it, Look Pink, it was a hotel. Um, and early in the war, the Army moved in there. By Army, yes, because of course there was no official Air Force in those days. But the base that finally came there was the Army Air Corps involved. And we really never went over to the club except on later on when we got to know some of the officers who lived with us there. We would be invited sometimes usually on a Friday evening, I don't know why, to go over there and watch movies with them. And the movies were war films, that is, battle scenes. We saw a lot from Africa there. I mean, the movies there were all security and so
These
on.
were documentary type films?
Well,
Yeah.
it was exactly, the photographer had been on the front lines. I mean, this was active stuff, and they wanted to show it to the soldiers, and we were invited by some of the officers we knew to come and see that. And we saw that in the club itself.
You mentioned the cadets, I guess, standing at attention.
Yes.
Tell us that story.
Well, each weekend, probably Saturday, there would always be a pass and review, and I don't know what the total number was. It was several hundred cadets there, and as I understand it, the goal of having the cadets there was a part of the base that would train in navigation, but they were training in all the skills of being a soldier. And each weekend there would pass and review, and the soldiers would they were all asked. And I don't know, 500 people. There were a lot of soldiers. I don't know how many it was. And I think it was Sunday afternoons, I think. And it was always hot. It was always humid. It was always terrible. And they were asked to stand at attention, and you stood at attention, and you didn't move. As a young kid, I feel a little badly about it now, but one of the games, or one of the contests we had, was to count the number of cadets that fainted. Because they stood at stark attention for long periods of time, and apparently this was sort of the expectation that some would not be able to do it, or I mean, it would pass out, and that meant you were washed out. Then you were finished as in your interests as being a airborne person, whether it was navigator or pilot or anything else. If you passed out, and the cadets, they're not really cadets, but they were young soldiers. The people standing next to them were not allowed to move. They just went thunk, and nobody did anything.
They couldn't help them.
Nope.
Right. Wow.
And so our game was to count the number per week that fell. It was 2 or 3, not huge numbers, but they just lay there and nobody moved a muscle.
Well, I want to wrap this up with, you have an amazing story about an incident that happened during the war next door to the Boca Raton Villa. So please tell us about that.
All right, well, I'll tell you, because there were spies next door. And it all happened this way. It was the middle of the night. My father was away he was working in Chicago at that point. So my mother and my sister and myself, and living in one of the villas I've described. And it was perhaps 2 a.m, and there was a loud banging somewhere. Woke us up, and really loud, kind of rude banging. We all got up. My mother, of course, out there, but we went with her out into our front porch there, a screened-in area. And on the other side, banging on the door, was a soldier in full-dress combat uniform with some kind of a gun in his hand on the other side of that screen door where we were, and said, someone told us that you've been flashing a light out to sea. And my mother said, "No, we've been asleep. We haven't been flashing any lights anywhere." But they said the lady in the next house north of you saw lights flashing, and that was why we came, because we thought they were coming over here. By the way, these soldiers had arrived on motorcycles, which are not known for being quiet. And at any rate, I can still remember it very vividly, because we saw this one soldier who was in a helmet and the whole business standing there, and at first that's all we saw. And then there were 3 or 4 that came with sort of in the at-rest position with their rifles, who kind of moved it up closer to the screen door. Behind him, we saw there were probably 4 or 5 or 6 people, soldiers out there, all with these big guns. And at any rate, so after my mother told them that, they all got on their motorcycles and vroom, vroom, and then made their way around 100 yards. They would have to go 10 yards maybe out to the street, and then another 20 or 30, and then down to the gate of the Sandburns house, which was the next house, a gated house right next door to us. And they went in, vroom, 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 and went up to the back door, which they found open. The Sandburns lived there half the year. They were gone. They were in Detroit. And from their point of view, the house was empty. I mean, it was a vacant resort home. But the back door was open when the soldiers arrived. They went inside, and it was obvious that somebody had been living in there with their canned goods thrown around that had been opened and used, and beds had been slept in, and just kind of, you knew somebody was living there. And then in that house, in the living room, facing the ocean, where they had a big bay window, and bay windows just didn't happen in those days, except they had a bay window, a nice big window. But standing right in front of the bay window were 2 things. One was a semaphore, a kind of signaling device, the kind you use out at sea, a light signaling mechanism, and the other was a telescope. And they're right there, pointed out through that big bay window out to sea, obviously used for messaging whoever was out there in the ocean. And so that was an important observation. There was nobody in the house at that point. The soldiers all left. They made this observation, and they went back to report it. And in doing so, as they left, they closed the door. But then the door was locked, of course. So that in terms of any other investigation in the next 24 hours anyway, they couldn't legally get back in. But anyway, they called Dr. Sandburn up in Detroit, and he said, "Of course, go ahead, do whatever you need to do." And they gave them permission. They went back in a day later, but anyway, that was a day after the bad guys had gone somewhere else.
And this was during blackout
Yes, at 2 in the
conditions,
morning.
right?
Yeah.
So tell us just briefly about what blackout meant.
Okay, it meant that everything was blacked out. In fact, we rarely went to Miami in the winter because with the shortened days, if you came home, you couldn't use your headlights. And so we were in the dark if you got delayed. And because of the gas rationing, we seldom went anyway. But you didn't go anywhere at night because you had no headlights. And in your house, took great care to make sure all the blinds were closed, and sometimes to put up special curtains and things, but to keep the light out from cars, houses, anything that might be used by the Germans, who we knew were out there, another 100 yards in the ocean, and using some kind of way to hone in on a particular site or not. So,
It would silhouette the ships at sea, I think, make them a good target, too.
well, let's see, the light
I
in
mean,
the
if
houses.
light shone out to the sea. Yeah.
Well, we'd allow them to use us for location, but it wouldn't shine on the ships. We were out there
Right,
several
right,
miles. Yeah.
Right, understand,
But,
yeah.
but the submarines that were out there, it would mean that if they saw a light, it would help them in their geography and knowing where they were.
Right.
There's very primitive radar or anything else at that point. was what you saw
Yeah.
counted more than it does now. Now you all look at a computer screen.
And we had the good radar, they didn't, part of the point, right?
That's right, that's right. Well, radar we didn't know anything about radar as citizens there. We never heard the word radar, even though the most important, a vital part of the reason that the United States and others won World War II was because of radar. And there's a longer story to that. I'm not sure you want me to get into that, but the short of that is that radar electronically was being developed first in England, and then all of that effort really moved over to the United States, and was centered really at MIT. And every week there was a plane would come down from Boston, where MIT is, with new ways of improving the radar. And Sally Ling wrote a wonderful book on this, and makes the point that early in the war, the radar that existed could spot a bus at 3 miles. I think that maybe it was 2 miles. Just you could see a bus, but after I think it was after 1 more year of development, you could spot a periscope at something like 3 miles.
Wow.
So it was a huge change, and that change was terribly important. Even on land it was important, but most of all in aircraft is where it really came in. And in terms of finding subs and finding anything with radar that worked. Before that, it was line of sight, and that was really a limit. But so the Boca Raton is as I say, we as citizens here then never heard the word radar, and so a secret was well kept. But in fact, what was going on was the implementation of the electronics. It wasn't created here, but it was implemented and then used by all of the American and I suppose English aircraft for that purpose.
Well, we need to, I guess, wrap up now, but I want to ask you when your family moved away and why, and where did you go?
Well, we came, as you know, because of family reasons, and when we left, it was for different reasons, but there were family reasons. And my parents just thought that kids growing up in Boca Raton with 10 in a schoolroom and so on was probably not the best education for us, if there was a choice. And that and my dad's real estate business was in his experience and so forth was in his contacts were in Los Angeles. So we moved back to LA, and my dad and I had a most interesting trip. My sister and mother were staying with grandparents, but my dad and I then took a great big trailer and put our worldly goods from Boca Raton and drove across country, which was right after, well, it was 46, but the United States and the whole world had not really recovered at that point, and finding a gas station was hard. Finding any water was hard. Everything was closed down, and you might see a sign for gas, and you go in, it was all deserted. Because during the war, people didn't drive and there wasn't gasoline and so on. But anyway, we made it with a lot of events that I can tell you about some other day.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Barrett. It's great to have this on record. And we're so happy to see you coming all the way from California. And I think that we'll close it down for today.
Boca Raton is a special place to me and my family and a lot of people. And I'm glad to be back and be a part of this.
Oh, thank you.